Hi, Tony here again from All the Remote Things, and this time I've got a fantastic guest with me. It's been a while, actually. It was, I think, BC, as I like to say, before COVID. Steve Berez, how are you today?
I'm great, Tony. How are you?
Fantastic. Yeah, it's really, really great to see you again. Steve, would you like to introduce yourself to everybody so they know who you are?
Absolutely, Tony. Steve Berez. I'm an advisory partner with Bain and Company. I've been with the firm for over 30 years, and I'm a founder of our enterprise technology practice about 25 years ago. For the last 15 years or so, I have been engaged and very focused on agile innovation, agile transformation across industries, and really enjoy helping clients and their companies improve their innovation and effectiveness through the use of agile principles and methods.
Yeah, and that's how you sort of came to my notice, because the one thing that you didn't say and you shot at yourself there is Steve's written a book as well. And
Yeah, yes, there is the book. There is the book. About 2.5 years ago, um, Daryl Rigby, Sarah Elk, and I um, captured our learnings in working with companies over those many years on improving their agility into a book we called "Doing Agile Right: Transformation Without Chaos." And the reason we wrote the book and the reason we called it what we did is because we saw so many companies that were trying to use Agile, but not getting the results that they had hoped to get from them. So they were doing Agile wrong, is what we found. And we learned a lot in helping companies um, make improvements in how they were applying Agile principles and methods and improving the results that they achieved thereby.
yeah, so it was about 2.5, 3 years would be right, because it was just before COVID that I think I had the pleasure of catching up with you, and it was on a previous podcast that I used to run that we spoke. And interesting was that we spoke through the book at length, and one of the interesting things was that you had a really good gamut of understanding of how transformations across the world, because you've seen quite a few. So the reason I wanted to get you back on this cast was to sort of, okay, you wrote the book, you've seen these transformations happening and changing, but we all know the world's been sort of flipped on its head since then. We've gone through obviously the pandemic, but we've also got, from the downturn and all those economic pressures, and et cetera, et cetera. So my question to you is, how have you seen it change since then, and how have you seen agile and its use change?
Well, you bring up a great point, Tony, about the timing of the book, and we did launch in May of 2000, so it was just a couple months after the pandemic really set in. And we even debated, is this the right time to put out a new book with all this other chaos and turmoil going on in the world? And what we ended up deciding, quite fortunately, is yes, it was actually the perfect time to publish a book on agility, because companies and individuals were far more in need of agility because of the rate of change of the world. Uh, a very simple example is companies needing to move their sales channels online far more frequently, or companies needing to enable workers to work in a very different way remotely for many jobs. So the need to be able to pivot and respond to change and innovate the way an organization works, as well as its products and services, was far more important after March 2000 than it was before. And it just became very clear that agile principles, methods, practices were a really important part of helping to address this dramatically changed world. Uh, so the importance of the topic was really only enhanced by the pandemic, but also the way that teams and companies worked through actually executing agile clearly needed to evolve somewhat. And that, the biggest change was moving from what was most typical for an agile team being in person to what was then becoming most typical to agile teams working in a distributed fashion.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So that's the obvious gamut that we want to cover there. So, obviously when you released that and we were going through that process of remote and hybrid, everybody went home, everybody did what they needed to do to get going and survive. But then we got out of that flight and fight mode, and it became, okay, well, this thing's actually going to continue now, and there's sort of this tension now where it's here to stay, a lot of organizations. So if you're talking transformation and you're talking agile transformation, but you're talking remote and hybrid, what's the big differences that you've seen and you see now?
Well, it's a big topic. Um, First of all, just in terms of the frequency or preponderance of distributed work, it went from a relatively small number of companies. There have always been companies like GitHub that have been worked in a distributed fashion, throughout their history. But most companies, certainly prior to 2020, were um, were working in person. So we went from that to where most companies were working in a distributed fashion for knowledge work and other work that lent itself to distributed, remote methods. And now we've seen the pendulum swing back, but not swing back all the way.
Yeah.
And what's really intriguing is it's almost as though every company has a different approach. And we've studied much of the practices and results of this over the last year or so as companies have beginning to settle into what might be called the new normal, to see, what are companies doing, and then what kind of results are they getting from that. Uh, Another really big change over this period is that distributed teams had better and better tools to work together. So what we historically thought of as a tax, kind of a productivity or effectiveness tax, when teams worked in a distributed fashion, that began to reduce because high quality video was available. Collaboration tools for electronic. I don't want to use particular companies' product names, but electronic whiteboards and other kinds of planning tools that allow people to use what were historically flip charts or dashboards or things that would be done in person. They could do them very seamlessly with electronic tools. So all those things became more effective, and that allowed teams that were working in distributed fashion to close that gap with in-person teams. The gap that couldn't be closed entirely is what I would call the trust gap, because just by the nature of human beings, we bond with others more effectively in person than we do remotely. So teams that work remotely, for them to be most effective, typically find some way to create that bonding experience. Sometimes, and often, it's through a certain percentage of time working in person. Sometimes it's just through, let's say, a quarterly event where people get together. And then sometimes, if it's just not possible for people to get together ever, they go out of their way to spend time in more social, even though it's hybrid, but more or remote, but more social situations. So they're not doing work, but they're talking about their family, they're relaxing, they're having drinks together, but in different places, etc., so that they can find ways to build that trust that would happen more naturally in an in-person situation.
Yeah, I'd love to pick you up on that. That trust situation is very interesting because I've talked to a number of companies across the world, and one theme that seems to run deep for me is whilst the word that you were using, distributed, is interesting because, in the day, when I first started doing this kind of thing, distributed was the word that we used, right? Because you had people, then it became remote and hybrid are the kitsch terms. But the reality of it is distribution is really what's happened, isn't it? Because you're seeing organizations that actually now have access to talent all over the world. So, and it's sort of a double-edged sword. You've got people can work for anyone in any place at any time they want to, and organizations can have any time, any place, and anyone they want working for them. But then there's that trust that has to be built into that layer of doing so. Are you seeing that a lot?
Seeing
Seeing that whole gamut of the people across the different countries coming together in different organizations that normally would work for those organizations.
So in other words, companies that might have people all over the world, are we seeing them bringing them physically together more frequently?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say that there's an increasing recognition, as companies have, as more companies are working with distributed teams, that they need to do something to ensure those teams build personal relationships, with each other. So yes, getting people physically together who are normally too far apart to work together on a weekly basis is becoming more common as companies recognize the importance and the value of that. I would say that there's just a very broad range of what companies are doing, and even within a company, what different functions are doing, different roles, and then even within those roles, what specific teams are doing. And our biggest message here is that all of this needs to be designed thoughtfully. There's no one right answer for a company, for a function, or for a specific team. There are a series of considerations and trade-offs to be made and thought about, and then kind of the right solutions will hopefully emerge. But in true agile fashion, we would also strongly advise companies, functions, teams to be constantly monitoring the success of whatever the model they're in right now, maybe to even try different models and test them, but to, through a test and learn process, evolve to the model that is working best at any given time for any given type of work for any given team. But to be more specific, most companies, for knowledge work, for work that can be done in a remote fashion, are gravitating towards a hybrid model, and 2 to 3 days a week seems to be the most common norm that companies are gravitating towards. Again, there's a full distribution. Some are fully remote, some are fully in person, but the majority are actually now moving to a hybrid model. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because that if you were working fully on site, having 1 day a week of flexibility would be tremendously valuable to the employee, and shouldn't reduce the effectiveness, productivity, trust of that team by very much. Take the other extreme. If you're working 5 days a week remotely, having just a day a week to be with your team in person and to build that trust and to work on the more complex things that require a lot of interdependency in person, et cetera, that's got to be very valuable. So fully remote and fully on site is probably not the best answer for most teams and functions, and that's why you get somewhere in the middle. That being said, we for sure want to be open to situations where roles or specific individuals do need to be fully remote. It opens up a talent pool of people who might otherwise be restricted due to family constraints or physical constraints. from being part of the workforce, part of specific teams and roles. So we want to be very open to that, and to ensure that in those situations, people have the best tools and the best processes, et cetera, to be able to make that work. And then again, also ideally that we invest the money needed for some periodic time when people can be together in person, just to build and maintain and reinforce the personal relationships and trust that ensues from that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, because it's also not just tech companies, right? So I think that's a bit of a misnomer here, is that people see this as just tech. This is all sorts of companies in all sorts of different shapes and forms. And I know that you work a lot with health as well, and those models. Are you seeing that right across the gamut of organizations?
Well, there again, I was mostly trying to describe what I'd call maybe the 70% middle, or gravitating towards these hybrid models, 2 to 3 days a week. But there are companies on each side of that. So, and I'll mention a few specific companies here, just with a caveat that um, you, policies change. I might be a little behind, et cetera. But at least based on my current knowledge, Goldman Sachs and Tesla are two companies that have said you're going to be fully on site. With maybe a few exceptions, our norm is everyone's on site 5 days a week. And then you've got companies like Dropbox or Airbnb that are saying actually fully remote is our model, or at least is an option for people, where we're completely fine with you working from home or anywhere else you want for that matter. But then, there's a again wide variety of companies in between, that are, like, let's say Apple, Google, that are saying we want hybrid work, a few days a week in, a few days a week out is completely fine. But you need to live near the office, because you do need to be in 2, 3 days a week, and therefore that's, we're not going to pay. I guess somebody wants to commute from Park City, they're able to when they're in Nickel, but we're basically expecting you to live within commutable distance to the office, even though you don't have to be in the office every day, because we want you to be in the office enough to build build camaraderie and to do the work that can be done more effectively when there's a lot of interdependency, in person. So but I think what these companies generally have in common is they've been trying to think through what is going to work best for their situation and their teams, and maybe some over time will find, maybe the ones that are requiring full on-site work will realize, hey, if we even had a little flexibility in that, a lot of people 1 or 2 days to work from home, we wouldn't, we could reduce our attrition rate, or we could get some of the talent that are turning us down because they don't want to work with that level of inflexibility.
So I'll take a little bit of a right hand turn there, because these organizations and a lot of organizations are still looking at this type of transformational change, right?
Yes.
And you talked about before, and doing agile right was about, transformation without chaos as well, right? But then you put in this whole change that came across, and so what I see, like yourself, I've been doing this a long time, and I see that there's a lot of transitional change, but not a lot of transformational change. And let me just preface what I mean by that, right? Is that you often see the flow of work being transitioned. But when I talk about transformational change, that's changing the governing of the system of work and how you fund it, and those types of pieces. I'm really interested to hear your take on what you think transformation really means.
Um, you're really, with that question, Tony, getting to the heart of the matter. And one of the observations that we had in working with companies over so many years that helped spur our interest in writing a book is we saw companies with many agile teams. most of the companies we were working with had some agile teams, but we saw relatively few agile organizations.
Mm.
So, well, if the teams are agile, well, why is the organization having trouble putting out products more quickly, or products that customers really wanted more effectively? Or why were they having trouble updating their processes and technology to be more efficient in how they worked? And it's because having agile teams alone doesn't create agility. You have to create the conditions for those teams to be effective and to be empowered. And those conditions, you alluded to one, the funding model. Typically, it works best for ongoing innovation opportunities to provide funding in an ongoing fashion, and then to give the teams a lot of autonomy in how to use those funds to achieve specific business objectives. So instead of the traditional model where you're funding a set of scope, a project with a defined set of scope, and telling the team, go and execute this. And then you get to the end and you realize, actually, that wasn't really what the customer wanted, or maybe there were 3 or 4 changes that could have been made to make it much better, but we didn't give the team that flexibility. So moving away from that model to one where you're giving the team a set of outcomes, business outcomes, customer outcomes that you want them to achieve, giving them a funding envelope to achieve that, and in many cases, that's an ongoing funding envelope, and allowing the teams who are closest to the customers, who can test and learn and iterate and get that feedback, to really decide on what they are going to do with those funds to achieve those business outcomes. So funding model, critically important. Another element is leadership, engagement, and commitment to agile principles and methods. So in many organizations, maybe most organizations, there's a real fear of failure. And if I try something and it doesn't work, that's going to be bad for my career. It's going to be bad for my compensation. It's going to be bad for my reputation. And that doesn't really allow for testing and learning, because some of the most effective learning results from failed experiments, not successful experiments. And if everything you try succeeds, you're probably not trying things that are hard enough or ambitious enough. So we have to get that mindset to change. And that typically, you can do that in pockets, but if you're going to do it for the whole organization, the CEO and the CEO's leadership team have to be invested in that mindset change and have to be demonstrating it themselves. So when they come into a meeting and they're reviewing the progress of some initiative, it's not like, well, why didn't that thing work? Or, why couldn't you do this? It's more, how can I help you to overcome that barrier? Or isn't that a really interesting thing that you learned from that failure? What did you decide to do next? And, where did you take it? So the leadership, engagement, and personal behavior change is also a very important part of this. Compensation and reward systems typically have to evolve, where we're moving from individual-oriented measures to more team measures, and from behaviors or actions more towards outcomes. So that we're trying to align compensation with what's going to make the teams work most effectively. So those are just some examples of the broader business system that needs to change in order to make the agile teams effective and empowered. Maybe one other final one I'll mention is product management. The whole way that teams are connected with their internal and external customers. The function of a product owner in Scrum, or product management in general, is really, really the critical linkage between the teams that are executing the work, the business functions that are sponsoring those teams to achieve certain goals, and then the customers, internal or external, of those teams, and bring all that together in a way that's going to guide the teams to work on the most valuable work in any given sprint, at a given time and a roadmap that achieves the business objectives, that function is incredibly important. And it is typically um, underinvested in and really underperforming in most organizations because it's a new function. It's not something that a company that wasn't working in Agile would have just sitting around somewhere. The skills required to do effective product management are really quite broad, and they have to be trained and coached over time in order to be effective. So again, if you set up the Agile teams and you don't invest in product management, you're not going to get the outcomes you're looking for.
Yeah, and I guess that's the thing. The crux of the matter there really is that when you're thinking about that transitional versus transformational, I was talking about, it's really easy to attack that transitional state, but it's actually not so easy, and it can be quite scary for some organisations to talk about changing their funding model or changing their product management model and those things. So that's always interesting, and I think I imagine. The question there then is for you when you're working with those organizations is, given the economic downturn, what you're really talking about is an organizational, is innovation versus spend versus the ability for the organization to innovate and change. How are you seeing that?
Um, I agree that as we are heading into rougher economic waters and uncertainty, it often causes exactly the wrong behaviors of companies. Companies they pull back on investment. Um, they get very focused on tactical cost cutting. We're going to cut our employees by 20% across the board, and you see these waves currently of layoffs in the technology industry around that. The data shows layoffs. There's no compelling relationship between layoffs and improved company profitability over any reasonable period of time. It's often the opposite, that the layoffs drive out good talent, and the companies are having trouble achieving their goals even more so. So there's kind of maybe this short-term feeling, well, that's great, I've reduced my cost bar by X, but now are their products going to be as good? Is their service going to be as good? So are they perhaps going to have a revenue drop that is going to be greater than the quote benefit of the cost drop? Or are there other ways to reduce costs or improve the top line even in a recession or a less growth oriented environment? So, we believe that Agile is just a more effective way of innovating than in any other way, and that in downturns, innovation is needed as much or more than ever. Now, maybe it may be the mix of innovation and what the outcomes of the innovation are going to change somewhat. So perhaps we're not going to launch, as many new products, but we want to make sure that the products we have are providing the greatest value. So in the midst of a greater competition for fewer customer dollars, we're more on the winning side than the losing side because we have the better products, services, and value that our customers are getting from that. Or other types of innovation are process improvement and efficiency improvement throughout the organization. That requires innovation, technology innovation, process change, etc. So the work of Agile teams is just as vital, if not more vital, in a downturn as it is in a growth-oriented period. So companies need to be smart about how they're investing and where they're going to use their more limited dollars. And we suggest that moving towards more effective Agile methods and practices is a very good use of scarce dollars in this environment. The other thing I'd say is that you don't have to make big bets on Agile all at once. In fact, that's almost counter to Agile principles. becoming agile in an agile fashion is probably the most important difference we see between companies doing agile right and doing agile wrong. It's not about big edicts and we're going to suddenly change everything about the company all at once. What works more effectively is getting a small number of agile teams to work really effectively, understanding how agile works within the context of your organization, your industry, your customers, your software architecture, and all the other things that constrain companies in innovating. And then as you find that successful formula, then gradually rolling that out to more and more of the company. So it doesn't require massive upfront investments, which would be hard in a period of uncertainty. But the improvements are well worth that gradual investment when you do it right.
Brilliant. Steve, look, we're really close to the end of our time, actually. So I would like to have dug much deeper into that, but I think the crux of what you're saying there is really they can't afford not to invest in agility, given what's happening. It actually pays back the spend.
Absolutely.
Yeah, fantastic. Look, we're really close to the end, as I said. How can people get in touch with you? How can they get involved? Let alone just obviously you can get the book from Amazon, but how can they get in touch with you personally and talk to you further about some of the things we've talked about today?
Absolutely. Well, so you can reach me through our website, bain.com, where you could also find a lot more information, background on our book and our other points of view, a number of articles we've written over the years on the topic of agility, and be more than happy to connect with people who share an interest in the topic.
That's fantastic. You'll find all Steve's details in the show notes below. So don't hesitate to touch base with him. It's been fantastic having you on all the remote things. If you're watching this, don't forget to join our remoteaf.co and click on the community button and join us in our community. That'd be fantastic to have you. Steve, it's been fantastic having you on all the remote things today.
Thank you, Tony. Really enjoyed it.